In achieving a possible solution in ongoing issues over claims and the South China Sea, several attempts have been conducted, such as establishment of the UNCLOS and the ASEAN Code of Conduct, as well as the Arbitral Ruling, on achieving a consensus. December 10, 1982, they established the UNCLOS, and the UN recognized that the UNCLOS as a customary international law, but its vague wording on the South China Sea has led to countries finding loopholes around it. So, in November 2002, ASEAN Code of Conduct was established, and after 6 years in negotiating, ASEAN countries agreed to the declaration on the conduct of the parties in the South China Sea. So, this signals the first time of China agreeing to possible agreements on disciplinary over the region. So, on July 12, 2016, there was this arbitral ruling, and in the arbitral ruling, it stated that the PRC has no lawful claim to the area determined by the arbitral tribunal to be part of the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone and continental shelf. So the PRC and the Philippines, pursuant to their treaty obligations under the law of the Sea Convention, they are legally bound to comply with the decision. So despite the arbitral ruling, the difference in the objectives of the Philippines against China prolongs this dispute. So as mentioned by Attorney Henry S. Bensurto, in his presentation on July 19, 2021, in a Zoom conference which entitled Unpacking the South China Sea Arbitration in the Philippines' Quest of Archipelagic Integrity and National Dignity. So here it stated the Philippines' objective in the WPS and CSC. So there is a short term, which is the de-escalation of the tension, and there is this long term, which is the preservation of the status quo and the clarification of what is ours and what is China's property. So here, China's objective in the CSC is there is the short term, which is the de-escalation of the tension by moving the ships and deflecting international attention. There is also the medium term, which is the unilateral change of the status quo and consolidation of its gains, and its long term, which is the realization of its expansionist in the nine-dash line in the SCS and WPS. So he further added a possible solution in its conflict by stating that, owing the unique nature of international law, the enforceability of the ruling is not solely determined by the existence or absence of international police force, but rather through some sort of other means such as international pressure, international trade, or some other forms of factors or sanctions, among others. And actually, one only needs to have the will and creativity to do it. So here also stated that although God has given us resources and dominion over all the creations of the things of the earth for our good, we still need to work in order to benefit ourselves of the material things. So a food that is served to us is in our table will not fill or nourish us unless we physically lift our hands and use our faculties to feed ourselves of that food. So in the same manner, the tribunal ruling will not benefit us unless we ourselves would work for its enforcement. Now, to elaborate further on the possible solutions of of the territorial issues, we present some of the possible solutions to the claims of the ongoing conflict in the West Philippine Sea. We have four. Resolutions. First is the application of the rule of law. Second is the multilateral approach. Third, we have the application of interim and medium measures. And lastly, we explain why war is not an option for us.
Application of rule of law. Is there a way to enforce the arbitral award using the rule of law in the absence of enforcement mechanism under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as the UNCLOS? According to Justice Corona, there is a formula, and not only one, but many ways of enforcing arbitral award without going to war with China, using only the rule of law. The Philippines and Vietnam can enter into a sea boundary agreement on their overlapping extended continental shelves beyond the Spratlys area. The premise of the Sea Boundary Agreement is the ruling of the Arbitral Tribunal that no island in its Spratlys generates an exclusive economic zone that would overlap with the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam or the Philippines. China cannot prevent Philippines and Vietnam from entering into a sea boundary agreement. And that is because a sea boundary agreement will apply the arbitral award by state practice, fortifying and enforcing the arbitral award, and bridging the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. In fact, Vietnam has recently proposed such a sea boundary agreement with the Philippines. Apparently, the present government administration has not acted on Vietnam's proposal for fear of offending China. Philippines can enter into a similar sea boundary agreement with Malaysia on the adjoining exclusive economic zones between Borneo and Palawan. The premise of the sea boundary agreement is that no geological feature in the Spratlys generates an exclusive economic zone that would overlap with the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines or Malaysia. This will enforce by state practice the arbitral award and bridge the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. Such a sea boundary agreement will not prejudice our Sabbath claim because the University of the Philippines Law Center has issued definitive opinion that the territory of the Sultanate of Sulu, Borneo never faced the South China Sea. Malaysia has been proposing to sign with the Philippines a sea boundary agreement. Likewise, China cannot stop the Philippines and Malaysia from entering into a sea boundary agreement. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei can enter into a convention declaring that, as ruled by the Arbitral Tribunal, no geologic feature in Spratlys generates an exclusive economic zone, and there are only territorial seas from the geologic features that are above water at high tide. This convention will leave China isolated as the only disputed state claiming exclusive economic zones from Spratlys Island. This convention can be open to accession by all coastal states of the world, so that their right of freedom navigation and overflight in the Spratlys can be governed by this convention. The United States, United Kingdom, France, Japan, Australia, India, and Canada, countries that regularly assert freedom of navigation and overflight in South China Sea, can be expected to adhere to this convention. This convention will enforce the arbitral award by state practice, bridging the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. Justice Carpio offered 6 solutions in his commencement speech last July 19, 2019. The Philippines can file an extended continental shelf claim in the West Philippine Sea beyond our 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone off the coast of Luzon, where China is the only opposite coastal state. The Philippines can file this unilaterally with the United Nations Commissions on the limits of the continental shelf. China cannot invoke historic rights under its 9-dash line, which has already been ruled without a legal effect by the Arbitral Tribunal. China's own extended continental shelf does not overlap with the extended continental shelf of the Philippines in this maritime area. It is most likely that the United Nations Commissions will affirm the extended continental shelf of the Philippines in the same way it affirmed the extended continental shelf of the Philippines in Benham Rice. This will fortify and enforce, in accordance with the rule of law, the ruling of the arbitral award that in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines has full 200 nautical miles economic zone from the outer limits of which the 150 nautical miles extended continental shelf of the Philippines is measured. This bridges the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. The Philippines can send on patrol its 10 new 44 multi-role responsive vessels that were donated by Japan for the use of Philippine Coast Guard. These vessels are ideal to patrol our exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea to drive away poachers from other countries. This will assert our sovereign rights over this resource-rich maritime area in accordance with the UNCLOS and bridge the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. The Philippines can welcome and encourage the freedom of navigation and overflight operations of the United States, United Kingdom, France, Australia, Japan, India, and Canada in the South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea. The naval and aerial operations of these naval powers, which are in conformity with the UNCLOS and customary international law, have increased in frequency since the 2016 Arbitral Award and are the most robust enforcement of the Arbitral Award, bridging the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. The Philippines can send its own navy to join the freedom of navigation and overflight operations of these foreign naval powers to assert, on behalf of the Philippines, that there is an exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea belonging to the Philippines as ruled by the Arbitral Tribunal. This fortifies and enforces the Arbitral Award with the support of the world's naval powers within and outside Asia, bridging the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. The Philippines can invite Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei to conduct joint freedom of navigation operations in their respective exclusive economic zones facing South China Sea. This will be a common assertion by 5 coastal states that each of them has their own respective exclusive economic zones in the South China Sea, thereby enforcing the arbitral award that China's 9-dash line has no legal effect and cannot serve as basis to claim any of the waters of the South China Sea. Again, this bridges the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice. All these naval and aerial operations, whether conducted by the naval powers or by the ASEAN coastal states, uphold that there are high seas in the South China Sea, and around these high seas are the exclusive economic zones of the adjacent coastal states. When the navies of coastal states conduct naval or aerial raids in the West Philippine Sea, they affirm that there is an exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea, which would belong to the adjacent coastal state, which is, of course, the Philippines. The Philippine government can support private sector initiatives to enforce the arbitral award. The most creative and dramatic way of enforcing the arbitral award has been undertaken not by the present government administration, but by 3 patriotic, private Filipino citizens. The brave Filipinos, former Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario, former ombudsman Conchita Carpio Morales, and their council attorney Anne-Marie Cormenes, using the rule of law, filed a communication with the International Criminal Court challenging the Chinese leaders, headed by President Xi Jinping, of a crime against humanity. The communication charged the Chinese leaders of depriving tens of thousands of marginal Filipino fishermen and their families of their source of food and livelihood as a result of China's massive destruction of the atoll reefs in Spratlys. The massive destruction took place in the territory and exclusive economic zones of the Philippines. China, in creating artificial islands to host its air, naval, and other military facilities, dredged the atoll reefs and pulverized the corals. The atoll reefs are where the fish spawn and their eggs or larvae are carried by currents all over the South China Sea. Without the atoll reefs and Spratlys, the food chain of fish will be broken, and the fish stock in the South China Sea will collapse, adversely affecting about 200 million people living around the South China Sea who rely on fish from South China Seas for their protein. Also, under the Rome Statutes that established the International Criminal Court or ICC, leaders of a state who commit a crime against humanity are personally liable if the crime is committed in the territory of an ICC member state. If the ICC will proceed to take jurisdiction over the crime charge against the Chinese leaders, this will fortify and enforce the arbitral award, bridging the gap between the rule of law and the rule of justice, because it will punish those who have destroyed the exclusive grounds of Filipino fishermen and the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. And this will deter China from further destroying the Atoll Reefs in the West Philippine Sea.
Multilateral approach. Now, what is multilateral approach? In security arrangements, the principles of multilateralism are best embodied in a collective security system in which war against one state is considered to be a war against all states, ensuring that any act of aggression against a member of the collective system is met with a response from all members. Now, basically, this is a collective system wherein the countries who agree to the system will act upon or respond whenever there are acts of aggression or whenever there's a ruling or a decision that needs to be enforced. The support of first world countries to our course through express declaration of opposition to China's advances or through lending its military equipment is a glaring indication that the world would support our cause in claiming what is rightfully ours. Now, among these countries are the United States, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and also Japan. The United States, which maintains important interest in ensuring freedom of navigation and securing sea lines of communications, or SLOCs, has expressed support for an agreement on a binding code of conduct and other confidence building measures. Australia supports an Indo Pacific region which is secure, open, and inclusive. The South China Sea, a crucial international waterway, is governed by international rules and norms, particularly UNCLOS. Canada opposes recent Chinese actions in the South China Sea, including off the coast of the Philippines, that escalate tensions and undermine regional stability and the rules based international order. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom also highlight that claims with regard to the exercise of historic rights over the South China Sea or the South China Sea waters do not comply with the international law. Japan emphasized the enforcement of the rule of law in the West Philippine Sea to have a free, open, and peaceful situation in the disputed waters. This approach is best illustrated in the case of the Ecuador-Peru border dispute and the Rio Protocol. The treaty's provisions were overseen by four guarantor states: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the United States, four of the most powerful countries in the region. The guarantors are legally obligated to mediate and possibly arbitrate, which they eventually did for two major remaining impasses, all aspects of the Ecuador-Peru border dispute. Several factors contributed to favorable prospects for a settlement of this border dispute. First is the commitment by the political leadership in both Ecuador and Peru. Second is a change in popular attitudes in both countries. And third is the role played by the four guarantor nations under the Rio Protocol. The Rio Protocol is an example of a peaceful negotiation to end territorial dispute by means of mediation of other countries. This shows the possibility that settlement between China and the Philippines can be attained through multilateral negotiations.
Let us go to the third relevant course of action, the application of interim and medium measures. So interim and medium measures have the characteristics of being time-bound and practical. While the dispute is being settled and decided, there should be certain measures in order to at least stabilize the situation and enable the parties to create room for future cooperation and eventual resolution while managing our resources and avoiding self-destruction. We now look into the short-term solutions. Interim measures for the short term should have the parties work on their common interests that transcend maritime boundaries. These solutions will allow the states to work within areas under their control or impose on their own nationals, but which have beneficial effects for all the littoral states. The concrete solutions are as follows. First, the parties should openly and expressly commit to complete freedom of navigation and overflight throughout the SES, with the exception of occupied features and respective 12 nautical miles territorial sea zones. Second, the parties should not establish arbitrary and expansive military exclusion zones within the SES around their occupied features, as this could create dangers for legitimate commercial navigation and overflight. Third is, the parties should all take actions to stop activities that cause damage to marine living resources and habitats and cooperate in protecting the integrity of fragile marine living resources and habitats, combating illegal trade in endangered marine species, and committing to not cause any further damage to marine habitat. And lastly, the parties should create means of direct channels of communication between operational commanders of military, law enforcement units at sea that may be used during incidents and potential crisis events. So simply implementing these short-term solutions will go some way toward at least conserving and protecting the resources and slow down the ultimately self-destructive competition for dwindling fisheries. Now, let us look at the medium-term measures. So medium-term measures are more difficult, but could provide parties with a workable solution to address the question of managing resource activities. This is similar to interim measures with the exception of the individuality embodied. So medium-term measures are more cooperative in sense and are geared toward reciprocity. So there are two concrete solutions for the medium-term measures, the joint management and the joint exploration and development. So for the joint management, one way would be to address fisheries and petroleum activities within the 12 nautical miles enclaves around each qualified feature, sovereignty over which is admittedly disputed between the parties. So such enclaves would exist even without the SES arbitration award and could provide the starting point for joint or at least coordinated management. Within these areas, the parties should not allow destructive fishing and reciprocal access could be permitted. A system of documentation and reporting of destructive methods should be established. And lastly, for the joint exploration and development, when the states have already established joint management, joint exploration and development for petroleum resources may be undertaken through a treaty framework that either considers entire SES, not only areas claimed by the littoral states, but excluding territorial seas and archipelagic waters, or it could reciprocally provide access to parties' undisputed continental shelf areas. This means that a reciprocal stake in the exploration and development of petroleum resources by all littoral states and anywhere in the SES.
Lastly, war is not an option for us. The Philippine Constitution clearly prohibits war as an instrument of national policy. So, under Section 2, Article 2, as well as Section 18, Article 7 of the 1987 Constitution, it prohibits the government from going into war or to enforce an arbitral award. So, in addition to the said provision, Section 18, Article 7 of the 1987 Constitution provides that the President shall be the Commander in Chief of all armed forces of the Philippines whenever it becomes necessary that he may call out such armed forces to prevent or suppress lawless violence, invasion, or rebellion. So, under the United Nations Charter, war has been outlawed as a means of settling disputes between the states. So, it provides in Article 2 that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So, in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. So, Judge Carpio here stresses that in resolving the South China Sea dispute, war is not an option for us and has never been an option for us. That is precisely why the Philippines filed an arbitration case because war was never an option and that the Philippines will surely lose or lose badly if we go into war with China. So the former Foreign Secretary Albert de Rosario also added a remark that instead we should exhaust all diplomacy by protesting the threat of war. However unlikely it may be, in actuality we cannot allow others to play with the threat of war when we already submitted our disputes and have already clarified the ruling. So here we have the map of the nine dash line versus the map of the Philippine Padre Morillo's map. We find that Attorney Bill Hayton's commentary proper in ending this presentation. Attorney Bill here stated that the UNCLOS provides a neutral mechanism to allocate the world's maritime resources, but what we are seeing in the South China Sea is an effort by China to overturn it. In effect, China is deploying military might to overturn the legal rights given to other countries. If this is allowed to succeed, UNCLOS will weaken everywhere, and not just in the South China Sea. If countries can treat international treaties as simple piece of waste paper, then there is no agreement that is safe anymore. International order will begin to break down. So we are standing not just for the Philippines, but also we are representing all nations, especially the small ones like us, who are defending what is rightfully and legally ours. That is our presentation.